Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Well, glad to have you on board. If you'd take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, perhaps ring the bell, and we'd love to get a review, a 5-star review if possible, if you like the show. If you're new to us, well, this particular podcast is dedicated to dealing with vertebrate pest control. So these are animals that have a backbone, and we take some deep dives into some rather technical information to help wildlife control operators, pest management professionals differentiate themselves from the crowd, and we deal with topics that aren't normally covered in the wildlife control community. So basically this week, I'm going to be continuing my discussion on Brodifacoum. So last week we had part 1 on Brodifacoum, and this week we're going to deal with part 2 of Brodifacoum. And Brodifacoum, of course, is one of the most toxic rodenticides available. In fact, according to anticoagulants, it is the most toxicant for commensal rodents that we have commercially available. There may be some out there that aren't commercially available that may be more toxic, but that, as far as anticoagulant is concerned, it is the most toxic. So you can also reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to get thoughts about the show, what you like about it, what you don't like about it, maybe topics you'd like to have me cover. Otherwise, as I say, I'm just going to deal with what I'm interested in, what I come across. So you could also have criticisms as well, and so we've certainly dealt with one of those in a previous podcast in the past. So yeah, we even take criticism as well. So as I've said before, we are going to be dealing with Brodifacoum. So let me get the PowerPoint up and running here. And so there we go. So I've been calling it, of course, a little tongue-in-cheek, the nuclear weapon of rodenticides. Obviously, it is not a nuclear weapon. But my point here, of course, with a little hyperbole, is to point out that Brodifacoum is extraordinarily toxic. And so as we delve into this, I'm not going to repeat what's been covered in the previous presentation. I would encourage you to go back if you haven't seen it, if you're coming in here on part 2. Each one is sort of standalone, but they do combine together in terms of the information, so you might want to make sure you refresh your memory on that. So here we go. Now, biological half-life is basically the time needed for an organism to eliminate half of the volume. So let's say an organism had 1 milligram of XYZ chemical in its body. How long it took for the animal to process that chemical and break it down into its constituent parts, or to excrete it, would be its at half to 50%, so half a milligram, that would be the biological half-life. So if it took a week, then the half-life would be 7 days. So look at what we have here in terms of the amount of time required for Brodifacoum half-life. So warfarin, 15 hours half-life. So if you have a milligram of warfarin in the organism, 15 hours later, you're going to have half a milligram. Bromethylin, diphacinone, look at these are relatively short days when you compare it to Brodifacoum. Brodifacoum, you're going out to 120 days, essentially 4 months before you get to half And so that is an extraordinary amount of time when you think about it. So this is why the concern for second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, whether you agree with it or not, when California was basically putting heavy restrictions on the residential use of second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and I think even on professionals in terms of where they could use second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. I gotta say that 5 times fast. It's for this reason, because they're finding these second-generation anticoagulants in the residues of a lot of non-target animals, and particularly those that are considered endangered or threatened or valuable in one way or another. So this is a serious, serious problem. And of course, recently, this is October 13th of 2023, Governor Newsom signed in a restriction, of course, on difascinone. Difascinone was then added to that second-generation anticoagulant list. And look at the half-life for difascinone. It's 15 to 20 days. And why did they do that? Well, they found difascinone, which is a first-generation anticoagulant rodenticide, in the residue tissues for a lot of animals that they were looking at as well. And also, you could read the literature, and you're finding it there in addition. So, it's bad, right? So, but Brodifacoum takes this half-life issue to an enormous level. So this is why when I talk about Brodifacoum as quote-unquote the nuclear weapon, it's obviously not. Just to repeat it, I don't need people yelling at me, oh, it's not nuclear. I know it's not nuclear. I'm just trying to use some very flowery language to drive a point home. And this is part of the evidence for that 120 days for the half-life. So it's quite serious here. So, but I don't want any of these things banned, right? This is, there are going to be situations where you need Brodifacoum to get the rodent problem to where it needs to be. And so I don't want these products eliminated, but I want to emphasize the importance to understand what we're using when we're using some of these products. Don't just simply say, oh, I just want to kill them all, let God sort them out. We want to be sure we're using the appropriate tool. Don't use a sledgehammer when a hammer will do, right? Don't use a hammer when a screwdriver will do, right? So you want to try to use the technique and the materials appropriate to the level of the problem, right? Don't use a grenade when a knife will do, right? So you want to be sure we're using proper proportion in terms of the problems that we need to solve for our clients, right? I don't want people to live with rodents, with commensal rodents. I don't want that. And so this is why we need Brodifacoum to be available. But we want to be careful and recognize that when we're pulling this out into our toolbox to put it into action, there are consequences for that if this goes out into some non-target animals, right? Or if another animal eats one of the animals that have been treated with Brodifacoum, right? This is some serious, serious stuff. So what we're finding, it's not me doing the research, I'm getting this information from the literature, is what they found is that metabolism has a less of effect on Brodifacoum than excretion does. So it's not being metabolized by the liver, it's being actually excreted out into the feces. So, which is interesting because other rodenticides are metabolized, like warfarin. The organism, like the mouse, is breaking that product down in the metabolic system. Now, there's going to be probably some excretion with that as well, but when it comes to Brodifacoum, there's something about that chemical that's hard for the animal's body to break down. It has to sort of eliminate it rather than break it down. So this is a interesting thing. What are the effects? Now, if you have a rodent, for example, that's excreting out the Brodifacoum into its feces, what are the secondary risks for that? I haven't seen anything in the literature that suggested that the droppings of rodents treated with Brodifacoum could be a secondary poisoning risk. Normally we think of it as the predator eating the carcass of the dead mouse, not thinking about the droppings. But what about insects that may be eating the droppings? Could there be some transfer over into the insect, and then an insect is then eaten by something else? Could that be an issue? You can see where these challenges or where these questions can go to, right? We don't know what we don't know, and I certainly don't know on that particular question. But I just was figuring I'd ask that particular question and throw that out there for something to think about. But again, I don't want Brodifacoum banned, right? I don't want it eliminated. I don't want the EPA to eliminate this product from our availability because it's important. But nevertheless, we have to realize it's a serious product. Take it seriously. It is important. Field studies with Brodifacoum found that it had high success rates, which make perfect sense, right? If it's the most toxic product, anticoagulant that we have, well, don't be shocked when it works, right? I mean, so 95 to 100% levels of control in areas where stored crops and livestock areas, those are some of the two most difficult places to control rodents. Why is that? Well, because there's so much food available. Just shows you that if a mouse or a rat is consuming this stuff, it's essentially a walking dead animal, right? Because obviously it takes a few days to take effect to kill the animal. So this is why we don't want Brodifacoum eliminated. It is a necessary product when you have a large amount of competing food sources that the client cannot clean up, right? Not all problems with food are due to poor sanitation. Sometimes it's an issue of the dynamics, like cows are sloppy eaters, right? So you're not going to get a producer being able to quote unquote sweep up after every cow meal, right? It's just simply not practical. But this is where we would want to use a Brodifacoum situation if we have to get that rodent population down, because we have so much competing food sources, we may need to use it, but there are risks, right? So always make sure you're following the label and realize if you're dealing with a hoarder or something, or someone in a house where there's just food all over the place and the client's not being cooperative with you, Brodifacoum may be the only thing. You may have to start with Brodifacoum because you're not going to get the person to reduce the food availability. Again, this is the challenge that you're going to face with. What happens after a single dose, right, of Brodifacoum? So what they found is what happens when a rat, for example, starts being exposed to Brodifacoum. What are the symptoms? And so here's some things that you may find if you're seeing a rat that has been sick. A brown rat, of course, for those of you who don't know, is a Norway rat, right? So there's a movement away from calling them Norways, and so the movement's calling them brown rat, right? So brown rat poisoning symptoms when they're affected by Brodifacoum is increased crouching, increased lying down, increased curl position, and increased paralysis. And death is often within 7 days of exposure. This particular rat was fed one waxed block. Okay, that's all it took. Didn't have to eat a whole lot, although I think that is a fair amount. That's what it took. And so they were monitoring and when do those symptoms occur? Day 4, right? Because there's a delay effect with how quickly Brodifacoum begins to take effect on the rodent. So what are the effects on house mice? Now, some of this information I have already discussed in a previous podcast, discussing a particular article that was done by Frankova in 2017, where he pointed out that Brodifacoum seems to have a dietary suppressive effect. In other words, when house mice are eating Brodifacoum, after a couple of days, they just seem to stop eating the same amount. So that's actually good news, because what it does is it reduces some of the impact of secondary poisoning, because rather than getting 4 doses, maybe the rodent's only going to get 2 or 3.5, right? So that's important for reducing secondary poisoning. But look at how long they're living. When a mouse is getting it, the males are living 14 days, females are living 9 days. So we need to be patient with our use of Brodifacoum here. Here's an example of that Frankova article, their effect on feeding behavior. Notice the eating of the animal, it drops precipitously starting on day 4, right? And then it really drops off a cliff after that. And so why does this matter? And so if they're consuming so much less food, maybe there's less risk of being overdosed, and that lowers, not eliminates, lowers that risk of secondary poisoning. You could hear the whole presentation in that other podcast. Just do a search on Brodifacoum or Frankova. So how about Brodifacoum and skin absorption? And so you're like, well, this is what kind of skin absorption? Well, actually, they would do these types of studies, and they take a rat and they would expose it through its skin to find out how much does it take to kill a rat through its skin, right? And so what this means is this is why it's important for us to be wearing our gloves, right? That's why the label will tell us to wear gloves when you're handling this product, right? So because if it's affecting a rat, if it can be absorbed through the skin of a rat, could it be absorbed through the skin of us, right? Well, we're going to use the rat as a proxy for us, for example, right? So wear your PPE. Notice it only takes 3.2 milligrams per kilogram to kill a rat. Or another study found 7.5 milligrams per kilogram. So you can see the studies can vary depending on how they were performed. And there's always variation in study. There's one philosophical concept that says no two scientific experiments are ever identical. Okay, so take that in knowledge with you. So how much does it take to kill a rat by inhaling Brodifacoum? What's the LD50 for that? Well, turns out when they aerosolize the product, it's 3.0 milligrams per kilogram. There you go. Who knew? So don't snort your Brodifacoum, right? So these are, again, dangerous products, important products, but the analogy I often use when I give training events is simply this. Toxicants are like guns. They're great when they're used appropriately. Like with a gun, when a gun is pointed in the right direction and used responsibly, that's a good thing. When it's pointed in a bad direction, bad things happen. Well, the same thing when it comes to rodenticides. When they're used appropriately, they are a critical tool in managing commensal rodents. When they're not used carefully, bad things can happen, right? So we want to make sure we're careful with this. Well, what about the lethal concentration, LC50, for non-targets? Well, this is why we have to keep Brodifacoum out of our water supply, out of streams and ponds, because look at how little it takes to kill fish, right? 0.04 milligrams per liter. Think about that. Not even a gallon, right? A liter. That's like a little more than a quart. Less than 1/1,000,000th of a liter. So it's 4 cents out of a dollar, basically, where there's $1 million. So 4 pennies out of $1 million is needed to put in 1 liter of water to kill fish. That shows you how toxic this particular product is, even to fish. So don't let it get into water sources. How about soil? How long does Brodifacoum last in soil? And this could be a concern. It's not really so much of a concern for us today because we don't broadcast Brodifacoum, right? It's not like we're using it in an agricultural situation where we're going to go out and kill ground squirrels with it and do a broadcast baiting or something. But if we did, how long would the Brodifacoum last in the soil? Well, they found that at that 50% mark, right? How long would it take? 157 days at 20 degrees centigrade. Now, you may not know. I'm trying to just think of what 20 degrees centigrade is. So let me pull that up to see if I can give you that number here. 20 degrees centigrade here. 20... And let's see that's 68 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So notice how when it gets colder at 12 degrees centigrade, that's 53.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It stays in the soil at 298 days till you get to half concentration, or the duration time, right? So the duration time, 50%. So that can stay in the soil for a very long time. So if you're spilling it, if you're using some pellets or something, pick it up off the ground. We don't want that stuff getting into the soil. So what about resistance? Has there been any indication of rodents exhibiting resistance to Brodifacoum? And as far as of 2016, which is where the where the literature was telling me, I found no evidence of that in the literature. However, they did in New Zealand find some resistance to Brodifacoum in roof rats in New Zealand in 2022. And so they have an LD50 of 2.88 milligrams per kilogram for males, 3.81 milligrams per kilogram for females, and that number is 6 to 8 times higher than prior published lethal levels. And so they're believing that this is an example of resistance occurring now among roof rats in the country of New Zealand. So animals move, so it can happen here, and we need to be sure that we're using Brodifacoum and our rodenticides appropriately so that we don't get the resistance. So we're swapping things out, that we're using IPM practices, we're using traps, we are doing other things. But again, resistance doesn't mean they're immune, right? It just means it takes a lot more to kill a roof rat in New Zealand than it did prior with these particular resistant roof rats. So what about non-target LD50s, right? So now you're not going to be using these products, using this product on these animals, but the idea is they look into some of these other non-target animals to see what happens if there's secondary poisoning, for example. And what they find with Canada geese seem to be really sensitive to Brodifacoum. Less than 1 milligram is enough to kill your Canada geese. So 1 milligram per kilogram. So Canada geese can, they can weigh probably 10, 15 pounds. So that'd be like 5 kilograms. So 5 times 0.75, you're getting out to about 3 to 4 milligrams per kilogram to kill a Canada geese, right? Per kilogram, it'd be 3.4 milligrams for a full adult Canada goose, if my numbers are correct. So house sparrows, again, are relatively resistant when you compare it to a Canada geese. It takes more than 6 milligrams per kilogram to kill a house sparrow. And again, a ringneck pheasant, even more resistance, takes 10 milligrams per kilogram. So different animals have different levels of sensitivity to Brodifacoum, but nevertheless, you think about even 10 milligrams, that's not a whole lot when you think about a 2.2 pound animal, right? So it's not a whole lot. What about chickens? A lot of people are raising chickens on their property as people wanted to have fresh eggs in their own backyard, but there's obviously going to be rodents that are going to be accompanying that type of thing. How much does it take to kill a chicken with Brodifacoum? Well, they're the LD100 here, not the LD50. What's it take to kill 100% of the chickens? Well, that number is 10.5 milligrams per kilogram. So they only tested 4. A lot of these studies, the IACUC, that's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, won't allow large numbers of animals like they would in the past. So they've got to use what they've got, and so here they were able to use 4. All 4 chickens died in 6 days when they were exposed to 10.5 milligrams per kilogram. And so again, not a whole lot. So you want to make sure if you're using Brodifacoum near a chicken coop, make sure that bait station is proper, and you'd want to be sure that you are only targeting the right animals, making sure if you have only mice that you probably dampen that opening down on your rat-sized bait station to only allow mice, and I have other podcasts on that as well. So what about secondary poisoning with barn owls? Well, barn owls will fed poisoned rats for 6 to 10 days. All of them died. Now, You may think, well, that's a lot of feeding. Well, this is what happens when we're doing a rodent job and you have, let's say, a pretty serious rat infestation and you're hitting it with Brodifacoum. There's going to be owls around, right? This is something we often forget about, and that is there are around. Even if we don't see them, they're nocturnal primarily. They're quiet when they're flying. We often don't see these animals, and then we're killing sometimes animals with secondary poisoning that we're not even familiar with, right? So we're not even aware of it. It's not like we're trying to be mean, it just happens. And so that's why there's so much concern about secondary poisoning with these anticoagulants. And so I'm not optimistic. Things are not looking good. And the EPA, I'm recording this now on December 7th, 2023. EPA has just come out with another report about endangered and threatened animals with some of our anticoagulants, and looks like even further restrictions are coming down the pike. So I'm not looking forward to what's going to happen next year. So it's a comment period right now. I would encourage you to go online. I may do a presentation on that in the future, but things are looking kind of tough. So even if we sort of stay our execution on some of these changes, we need to do a better job making sure we're targeting the right animals to try to reduce the risk of secondary poisoning. I don't think we're ever going to be able to eliminate it right now, but we need to do a better job. One of those is making sure that if we're dealing with mice, we shouldn't have a rat-sized opening on our bait station. Just my thought on that. So all three of these barn owls died. Not good. Just shows you how toxic this Brodifacoum really is. All right, well, on that kind of a negative or Debbie Downer note there, I do hope you found that information at least eye-opening in the importance about how serious Brodifacoum is as an anticoagulant product. So hopefully you found this helpful and maybe modify some of your practices, maybe using Brodifacoum and leaving that as sort of your go-to product when you really need to bring out the big guns, right? And so maybe not using it as your first line of attack, but using it in something when you need to use it for those really difficult jobs or highly sensitive jobs where you need to get things cleaned up in a hurry, not where some patience can be held. That maybe Brodifacoum is the way to go there. But let's not try to use it as our first line of attack for every single job that we have. So you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. I hope you do take a few moments, if you would, and subscribe to the channel. Do drop me a line if you tell me things about the show that you like or what you don't like. Perhaps you have topics you'd like to have covered. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thoughts about the show, ideas for shows, even criticism shows. Perhaps you want to be on the show. Would love to have you reach out and we could talk about getting on the show. I'm very passionate about getting new information out to the public, whether it's a technique, whether it's a new product. We love spotlighting new products on the show because information doesn't move as efficiently in our industry as it does in others. So again, I'm Stephen Vantassel. I'm the host here of Living the Wildlife. You may say, what's Living the Wildlife? Well, Living the Wildlife is basically we try to provide scientific, research-based, technical information on all things related to wildlife damage management with vertebrates, right? That's animals with a spine. And we try to train that with pest control operators as well as wildlife control professionals. If you're none of those things, we're glad to have you on board. But you as a homeowner or property owner, we'd be glad to have you here. But just understand, we get into the weeds. We go geeky right here on the Pest Geek podcast family, right? So that's what we do here. We do have publications available on my website to learn more. If you're looking for some fundamental information on wildlife control, you can definitely get the publications there. But our podcast, we go much deeper rather than the foundational stuff. And occasionally I'll touch on some of the foundational stuff too. We have some baiting shows as well and talk about some things about to enhance your use of baits for traps and also rodenticides as well and some other topics. So, all right, well, that's enough for today. We're getting into the holiday season. I do hope you take some time with your family and to relax and reflect. And don't forget, we need to prepare for the new year because it's going to be here sooner than you know. So you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.